Hi class, this is Sir Alex Vasco and welcome to our lesson in General Biology 2. Today we are going to discuss Lesson 10, Animal Circulatory System, which is all about how blood travels around our body. Previously, we have discussed about the pulmonary system, which is how oxygen enters our system, or basically the breathing, how we breathe air. But related to that is actually the circulatory system, which is basically the story on how we transfer the oxygen we breathe into our body. So the pulmonary system and the circulatory system are actually working in tandem in order to transfer those oxygens from our lungs into the tissues of our body and into the cells so that our cells can undergo cellular respiration. So in order to start our discussion on circulatory system, let's start a little bit of discussion about the system itself. First, the circulatory system includes two important parts, which are the vessels and the heart. The vessels is basically the network where the blood travels. This includes the arteries, veins, and capillaries. Later, we'll go more in detail on what these different networks do and what type of blood passes to them and basically what their functions are. Next, we have the heart, which is the main pump of the circulatory system. This is what creates the pressure, mostly the pressure, because there's also some gravity that works on the pressure in our blood, but the heart is what gives the pressure or the push for the blood to move everywhere in our body. One thing to note though is that in the circulatory system, ours is actually quite what we call the closed system, which means our blood is only moving through the vessels. It is not basically outside our body coating our organs, which means the interstitial fluid which surrounds the cells, which surrounds our organs, is not usually, or it's not mixing with our blood. Our blood is contained within our blood vessels, which is quite different to some invertebrate which has a open circulatory system wherein the circulatory fluid or the blood is basically bathing the internal organs, meaning they do not need blood vessels in order to transfer oxygen onto their organs because the blood itself is surrounding their organs. So that is one of the main differences for us, a lot of mammals. Our system or our circulatory system is closed. It's separated from the interstitial fluid or the fluid that surrounds a lot of our cells and our organs. So first, let's discuss on the first from the two major parts of our circulatory system. Let's begin with the heart. So the heart is a very complex muscles composed of cardiac muscles, and it consists of not two pumps, two functions. First, it pumps blood through the lungs, which is what we call the pulmonary circulation. So every time I talk about the pulmonary circulation, it is the network wherein the blood pumps, or the heart pump bloods papunta sa mga lungs natin. So from heart to lungs. And then we also have a system wherein we call the systematic circulation, wherein the heart pumps blood through the rest of our body. So sa mga limbs natin, sa ating head, arms, legs, and everywhere in our body, our internal organs, our skeletal muscles, etc. This is the systematic circulation. So let's discuss about the structure of the heart. So the heart looks something like this. No, it's not yung mga emoji na heart. It's quite different, but it's usually around the size of your fist for humans, and it has 4 chambers. We have the atriums, or the atria, and the ventricles. And 4 because we have 2 atria, one on the right and one on the left, and then we have 2 ventricles, one on the right and one on the left. So these top portions right here are what we call the atrium. So we have our right atrium and our left atrium. Please do not get confused, because this heart that you're seeing here is how your heart is positioned while you are facing. So this is basically your right and your left. This is not mirrored. Okay. So this is what your heart, basically how it sits on your chest. Okay, so there's four chambers. We have the right atrium and the left atrium, and then we have the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And then there are some valves, or basically the openings that we'll discuss later what their uses are. We have the tricuspid valve and the pulmonary valve, the tricuspid, and also the mitral valve and the aortic valve. So sometimes you might hear me mention about AV valve. AV valve is basically atrioventricular valve, which includes the tricuspid and mitral valve. This valve is what separates the atrium from the ventricle. So for example, look at the right atrium and right ventricle. This opening right here, which separates the atrium and the ventricle, is what we call the tricuspid valve. Tricuspid because there's actually three openings. And then we have the mitral valve, which is another AV valve, or atrioventricular valve, which separates the left atrium and the left ventricle. And then we have what we call the semilunar valves. Semilunars because there's actually only two openings. We have the pulmonary and the aortic valve. Pulmonary valve is found basically what separates the pulmonary artery, which is this right here, and your left or right ventricle. So this is where the blood exits from the heart to the arteries. And then we have the aortic pulmonary aortic valve, which separates the right or the left ventricle, and it leads it to the aorta. Aorta is another type of artery. Okay, so let's discuss how the blood flows, or the basically the direction of the blood flow. Okay, so let's start with the deoxygenated blood. Okay, so what do I mean by that? When we talk about deoxygenated blood or oxygen poor blood, these type of blood is basically the oxygen they contain is already used up in our body. So what it needs to do is it needs to go back to the heart and then back to the lungs, so it becomes oxygenated, and then back to the heart and then into our bodies. So this blood is from all over our limbs, enters the blood via the veins. We have two very important veins. Later we'll discuss more specifically what veins are for, but in general, veins is what transfers blood pabalik dun sa puso, no? So from the body to the heart, we use the blood vessels called veins. And then we have two main veins that leads into the heart. We have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. Superior and inferior doesn't necessarily mean one is better than the other. It's just the positioning. Superior above, inferior below. So we have the superior vena cava, which leads the blood from the limbs or from the rest of the body pabalik dun sa heart natin. Usually this is the blood coming from the upper region of our body, from our head to our arms, sa chest area natin. Okay, our inferior vena cava, on the other hand, is what brings the body from the lower portion of our body, or what brings the blood from the lower portion of our body, like our legs, hips, stomachs, around that area, pabalik dun sa ating heart. And both the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava leads first to the right atrium. So this is our right atrium here. So this is still a deoxygenated blood. So means it needs oxygen. Okay, so what happens then after entering the right atrium, it will then be led into the right ventricle via the tricuspid valve. Later we'll discuss about the circadian rhythm, which is basically the contraction and the relaxation of our heart muscles. But when the heart muscles contract, basically, especially when the right atrium contracts, as you can see here from the right atrium, it pumps blood papasok from right atrium to the right ventricle. So when this contraction happens, it opens the tricuspid valve. This is your tricuspid valve right here. So the deoxygenated blood, or the oxygen poor blood, moves from the right atrium, enters the tricuspid valve, and enters the right ventricle. Okay, and then the electrochemical signal will then travel from the atrium papunta sa ventricle, and then the ventricle will contract. And when that contracts, the blood will then go up, no, palabas, and it will move from the left ventricle to the pulmonary valve. It will open the pulmonary valve. So valve is another opening. It's a type of semilunar valve. So there's only two openings. The tricuspid valve has three openings, no? Okay, so when the right ventricle contracts, the reason that the blood does not flow back into the right atrium is because how the tricuspid valve is set up. Kumbaga, meron siyang mga, you can think of this as string dito, no, which locks the tricuspid valve. So even though you push the blood upward, yung tricuspid valve hindi siya bumubukas papasok sa right atrium. So you can think of this as your door. Your door only opens on one side, diba? So isipin mo yung pinto papasok siya kay left ventricle. Pero kapag nasa left ventricle ka, if you keep pushing the door papunta kay right atrium, hindi magbubukas si door. Kailangan mo siyang hilain para bumukas. So parang ganun lang siya. So when you're outside, the door says push. Pero when you're already inside, the door will say pull. So if you push it, it will not open. So that's the same concept for the tricuspid valve. But when the right ventricle then contracts, the blood pushed, opening the pulmonary valve, which is the opening right here, and then it exits from the right ventricle papasok sa tinatawag natin na pulmonary arteries. Okay, so one thing that is different between the artery and vein leads the blood papasok sa puso, while arteries leads the blood away from the heart. Okay, veins towards the heart, blood towards the heart, arteries, blood away from the heart. One thing na misconception about veins is that they always carry the oxygenated blood, but that's always not true, no? Later I will show why. Pero okay, so now, the right ventricle contracts, the pulmonary valve opens, and we call it the pulmonary artery because it leads blood away from the heart. And there's a clue, pulmonary, because it's an artery that leads to the lungs. So from the right ventricle, papasok siya sa pulmonary valve, and from the pulmonary valve, it will then go into the lungs, and then papasok siya dito sa mga capillary beds na nandun sa mga alveoli ng ating capillary or circulatory system. And then after having transfer of oxygen, so papasok si oxygen, maglalabas ng carbon dioxide, because this blood is also actually full of carbon dioxide, no? This blood is full of carbon dioxide, and then it will have a gas exchange dun sa mga alveoli ng ating circulatory system, and then after that it will then go back from our lungs papalik muna sa puso. Okay, so after the lungs, it will then enter back into the heart via the pulmonary veins. Again, veins. Dito, vena cava, vene, which is the veins, no? Pulmonary veins. So these are veins that lead, remember, veins are basically vessels that leads blood pabalik sa puso. So from the lungs, it will then go back into the heart via the pulmonary vein. So these are the examples of pulmonary veins. So from the lungs, it will go to the pulmonary veins. Papasok siya kay left atrium. And then magkocontract sa left atrium. The mitral valve will then open, which is another type of tricuspid valve as well. May tatlong openings si mitral valve, no? And then when the left atrium contracts, the blood transfers papunta kay left ventricle, which is what you see the arrow here. And then when the left ventricle contracts, ang mangyayari, mag-exit si blood. This is oxygenated blood na to, ha? This is blood with rich in oxygen na. So it just needs to transfer all over our body. Okay, so when the left ventricle contracts, the mitral valve is basically closed, same concept ng pintuan, and then the aortic valve opens. Aortic valve because it leads to the aorta. Aorta is a type of arteries, which is a major artery, which then will lead the blood everywhere in our body. So this rich oxygen blood will then now move everywhere in our body. So this is how the blood moves into the heart. No, from our body, papasok siya kay inferior and superior vena cava, and then it will enter the right atrium. It will open the tricuspid valve and enters the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle will contract. The blood will exit via the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary vein, which will lead it to the lungs, and from our lungs babalik siya sa not pulmonary veins, sorry, pulmonary arteries, and then from the pulmonary arteries papunta siya kay lungs, and then babalik siya sa pulmonary, using pulmonary veins, papasok siya kay left atrium. From left atrium, the left atrium will open, when contract, will open the mitral valve, pushing or forcing the blood kay left ventricle, and then the left ventricle contracts, pushing the blood to open the aortic valve so that the blood can enter the aorta, which will then be led everywhere in our body. So this is the whole process of, or basically yung direction ng blood natin, no? How we get the oxygenated blood, get it to oxygenated, and bring that oxygenated blood back into our body. Now let's talk about the circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythm, this is a discussion on the contraction of the heart. It's basically, I will repeat a lot of things, but it's basically just the contraction, no? So we have different phases. So the main purpose of the heart is to pump blood, no? And in order for the heart to pump blood, it has to contract and relax. And this series of contraction and relaxation is what we call the circad, or the cardiac cycle. I almost said circadian rhythm, that is different. So cardiac cycle. Cardiac cycle has basically the contraction called the systole and the relaxation called the diastole. So both the atrium and the ventricle can relax and contract. So the phase of the circadian or the cardiac cycle, I keep saying circadian rhythm, or the cardiac cycle, we begin with the atrial systole. So atrial, so that's basically the atrium. Systole, so systole is contraction. So we start with the contraction of our atrium. That's both for the left and the right atrium, and the atrial contraction will force blood into the ventricles, and then after the atrial atrial systole, magkakaroon na tayo ng ventricular systole. So ventricular systole is when the so when the atrial systole happens, the blood enters the ventricle, and then magkakaroon na tayo ng atrial distole. So hindi na magko-contract si atrium. So during that time, it will fill the ventricle, and then we will have the ventricular systole, which is the contraction of our ventricles. And then the contraction of ventricles, both on the left and the right, will open the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve to push the deoxygenated blood into the lungs and the oxygenated blood into the aorta and into our body. So that is the first phase of the ventricular systole. Second phase of ventricular systole is the opening of the semilunar valve, which is the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. And then after that, we will have the ventricular diastole, or basically the relaxation of the ventricles. And big sabihin, wala nang masyadong laman yung ating puso. And then during the late phase of the ventricular diastole, everything is relaxed. The bicuspid valves or the tricuspid valves and the mitral valve will actually open and fill the ventricles a little bit. So that is just the process. It's very similar kanina, but it's just the concentration and relaxation. But this is where we understand ECGs. This is where the ECGs come from. So I'm pretty sure you have seen this. If you probably seen dramas, sometimes they use this when this flat line. It's just basically mean that the heart stopped pumping. So when this is pumping, then sa mga tao na nasa hospital, it means the heart is still alive, that there's still blood pumping, no? So you will see on the ECG, this is what we call the ECG, is basically this line right here. So the P wave that we call is basically the atrial depolarization. Mag-start na mag-contract. This is the start of the contraction of the atrium. And then after that, it will then contract, and then it will then move into the relaxation of the diastole or the atrium. So that's diastolic atrial diastole. And then this bigger portion right here is basically a signal on the contraction of your ventricles. That's why you have the sharp right here. It means the ventricles starts to pump. Okay, and then when it starts to pump, it will have this a whole contraction process right here, and then it will repolarize. Repolarization is basically the ventricles starts to relax. Depolarization is start to contract. Repolarization is it starts to relax, and that's where you get your relaxed diastole or relaxed ventricle. So this is actually very important, this signal right here, because any abnormality in the pumping of the blood, because this is the normal pumping of the blood. So kapag may nakita ka pa na isang blip dito, it means there's something wrong. There's having an extra ventricular, or it could be an atrial contraction that shouldn't be there, no? So the ECGs are actually very important part of diagnosing heart issues. Nagpapa-ECG ka. And we're not going to do that because that is more when you go to college. You will learn how to identify some issues in the heart using ECGs, and that's very cool. So another thing though about this is, I'm pretty sure you might probably have asked, so saan nanggagaling yung lubdub ng puso? So if you listen to your heart, or even if you put your hand onto your wrist, you would see the lubdub part, no? Para narinig mo yung lobed portion ng heart. That lobe is actually basically the opening and closing of your tricuspid and semilunar valve. So when the heart, when the atrium opens and fills your ventricles after it contract, and then the ventricles starts to contract, it will close your mitral and your tricuspid valve. And when the mitral and the tricuspid valve closes, that is the first lobe, no? Lobe. And then after doing that, it will push the blood dun sa ating semilunar valve, opening the semilunar valve. And then when the blood exits the semilunar valve and the aortic blood will then close, that is the second lobe. So it's basically the closing of the valves that creates the lub-dub sound of your heart. So next thing, so what results, or bakit ba nagko-contract si heart? We know that the heart is made up of cardiac muscles, but in order for us to be able to have an involuntary motions, for example, our heart, yung pag-pump niya, this is an involuntary motion, it should have a smooth muscle, right? Well, that is true because some cells of the heart called the cardiomyocytes are types of muscle cells, cardiac muscle cells that is found in the heart, even though they're striated, which are like the skeletal muscles, which is what we use for voluntary movement. Their function is like a smooth muscles wherein it is involuntary muscles, no, parang involuntary movements. So these cardiomyocytes are the ones creating this depolarization because they rhythmically and involuntarily start to pump on their own. They start the electrochemical signal, which then be used this whole cardian cycle of systole and diastole. So that is the whole part of the heart. So now we know that the heart exits our heart via our arteries. So we have the pulmonary arteries and the aorta. So what will then happen onto our blood? Well, it will travel into our blood vessels. Blood vessels is very complex. So banggit ko kanina, we have our arteries. Arteries take blood away from the heart. So we have the aorta, which is the movement of the blood, no, the blood from the left ventricle palabas, and then it will lead this throughout our body. So this in here is type of an oxygenated blood. So this is for the systematic circulation. So aorta for systematic circulation because it leads the blood everywhere into our body. And then we have pulmonary arteries, which brings the oxygenated. So the ones in aorta are oxygenated. On the pulmonary arteries, these are the ones connected on your right ventricle, which carries the oxygenated blood into the lungs. Pulmonary kasi it will lead into the pulmonary glands, which is the lungs, and arteries because it takes away the blood. And then we have the veins, which take blood into the heart. That's why we have the inferior and the superior vena cava, which is where the blood from all over our body, the deoxygenated blood, will go back into the right atrium of the heart. And then we have another vein called your pulmonary veins. No, pulmonary veins is what leads, or pulmonary veins is what leads the oxygenated blood from the lungs pabalik sa puso. So there is a misconception. A lot of people think that veins only carries oxygen, poor blood, or deoxygenated blood. That is not true because we have a vein that carries oxygenated blood pabalik dun sa ating puso, first entering the left atrium. This is the vein that connects the left atrium into our pulmonary system. So going back into the main artery, which is the aorta. So from the aorta, it will lead into major arteries, into the minor arteries, and then into arterioles. Arterioles are very important because this is where it reaches into deeply into the muscles and organs of our body. And found in the arterioles are capillary beds, which has about 10 to hundreds of capillaries. Capillaries are very, very small in diameter that only one red blood cell can actually enter inside, and that is important because we want a lot of surface area to expose this red blood cells so we can have and we can facilitate that oxygen transfer either at the pulmonary level sa mga alveoli natin and into our cells and organs. So from the arteries, it will actually connect so these are the capillaries. Now from the capillaries, it will then connect into the venules. So, along the capillaries, dito na magkakaroon na ipapasa na ni blood yung oxygen niya papunta kay cell. And then, ang kukunin niya is CO2. And from the capillaries, that CO2 rich blood now will enter the venules. So, it's the continuation or the connection between your veins and your arteries. So, capillaries and then venules. From venules, it will go to the minor veins into major veins, and then from major veins, it will then bring back that deoxygenated blood back into the heart via the inferior and the superior vena cava, and then the whole process starts. So this is the circulatory system. This is how blood moves everywhere in our body and how oxygen is transferred in the body. Thank you so much, class. This is all about lesson 10. If you guys have any question, do not hesitate to message me. Thank you so much and have a great